Malik, a young black man, lives in a poor working-class neighborhood. His life isn't easy, but he always keeps love and compassion in his heart. One afternoon, on his way home after a hard day's work, Malik unexpectedly sees an elderly white woman collapsed on the sidewalk. The people around seem confused, unsure of what to do, but Malik doesn't hesitate to rush over. He kneels down beside her, checks her breathing, and finds that she is still alive. Malik gently pats her shoulder and calls out, "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The elderly woman doesn't respond, her breathing faint. Malik immediately pulls out his phone to call an ambulance, while also trying to reassure the worried crowd around him. While waiting, he takes off his jacket and drapes it over her to keep her warm. Only then do the people around begin to calm down. Looking at Malik with grateful eyes, Malik sits by the elderly woman, holding her hand and softly talking to keep her alert. He shares simple stories, like just getting off work, things he saw on the street, and the chill of late autumn winds. His warm voice and gentle care reassure those around him. When the ambulance arrives, Malik accompanies her to the hospital. He doesn't know who this elderly woman is, but he can't leave someone in need. On the way to the hospital, he keeps holding her hand, feeling her frailty and telling himself he must do everything he can to keep her safe. At the hospital, the doctor determines she is exhausted from physical weakness and needs rest. Malik stays by her side until she regains consciousness, ensuring she isn't alone in this unfamiliar place. Malik doesn't leave until Mrs. Emily, the elderly woman's name, gradually wakes up. He smiles at her and gently says, "Ma'am, you're awake now. Everything will be okay. Don't worry." Mrs. Emily looks at Malik's concerned face and feels the sincerity in his eyes. She doesn't say much, only nodding slightly and gripping his hand tightly, as if to thank the kind young man who stayed with her in her time of need. When she wakes up, the elderly woman sees a stranger sitting by her bedside. It's Malik, with gentle eyes and a face full of concern. Her name is Emily, and she feels grateful for Malik's kindness. When she hears from the doctor about what Malik did to help her, she can't hold back her tears. In Malik's eyes, she sees something familiar, a resemblance to her long-lost son. Emily once had a son named Jonathan, her only child, who went missing over 20 years ago. Since Jonathan disappeared, she has lived alone, filled with loneliness and sorrow. Remembering those years makes her heart ache. The pain of losing her son has never faded, and she has lived in emptiness and longing. Looking at Malik's face, Emily can't help but think of the son she loved dearly, the way he cared for her, the look in his eyes. All of it reminded her of Jonathan. After being discharged from the hospital, Emily invites Malik to her home for dinner as a gesture of gratitude. Initially, Malik feels shy, but he agrees, not wanting to refuse her kindness. In Emily's cozy home, they begin to talk, sharing stories about their lives and the hardships they've endured. Emily's home is warm, with family photos on the walls, memories of her younger years, and pictures of her son. Malik gazes at these photos, listening to Emily talk about Jonathan, feeling the pain and emptiness she has endured over the years. Emily shares stories of her days with Jonathan, the beautiful memories of their walks in the park, and the little games they played together. Malik listens attentively, feeling his heart open up. Deeply moved by her pain and loss, he feels a growing affection for her and wants to do something to make up for the losses she has endured. Malik lives in a poor neighborhood where everyone struggles to make a living. He works at a factory, a tough job but one that provides enough income to sustain his life. Malik is used to hardships, from waking up early to go to work to preparing his own simple meals. Despite the struggles, Malik never complains. He always keeps a sense of optimism and faith in the future. Malik has no family. His parents passed away when he was young, leaving him to grow up on his own. Loneliness is something Malik is familiar with, yet he always seeks ways to connect with those around him. He often helps his neighbors, from fixing things to taking care of children when their parents are busy. Malik believes that no matter how hard life gets, compassion and love will help him overcome it all. Malik's life is full of challenges but also sprinkled with small joys. He enjoys tending to the small garden in front of his house, where he grows flowers he has planted and cared for himself. Every morning, before going to work, he takes a few minutes to water the plants and admire the blooming flowers, which reminds him that there are still beautiful things in life worth hoping for. Malik also loves children, and the neighborhood kids see him as an older brother. He often plays with them, teaches them good values, and sometimes buys them little candies from his modest salary. When he met Mrs. Emily, Malik felt something different. He sensed warmth from her, like the affection a grandmother would have for her grandchild. Though they had only just met, Mrs. Emily brought Malik a feeling of family he had never experienced. This made Malik feel that his life had gained new meaning. He began to realize that sometimes life is not just about surviving each day but about relationships, about the love and care people can share with one another. After helping Mrs. Emily, Malik began visiting her regularly. He would bring small gifts like fresh bread or a few flowers he'd picked along the way. Each time he visited, he helped her with small tasks around the house, from fixing a leaky faucet to tidying up the garden. Mrs. Emily grew very fond of Malik, and his presence brought joy to her during her lonely days. They often sat together, sharing stories about life. Mrs. Emily would tell Malik about her youth, reminiscing about the beautiful memories with her son Jonathan before he disappeared. Malik listened intently, feeling the pain and emptiness she had endured over the years. He grew more compassionate toward her and wanted to do something to make up for the losses she had experienced. In return, Mrs. Emily showed a deep interest in Malik's life. She would ask him about his work, his dreams, and his hopes for the future. Malik was a bit shy at first, but gradually, he opened up and shared his modest dreams with her. He wanted a stable life, a small family, and hoped to help those around him. Mrs. Emily listened, sensing the sincerity in Malik's words, which only made her cherish him more. Over time, Malik and Mrs. Emily grew closer. Malik no longer saw her as just someone he had helped. He began to regard her as his own grandmother. Likewise, Mrs. Emily treated Malik as if he were her own grandson, and the bond between them deepened. Their evenings spent together, drinking tea, sitting under warm lights, and sharing stories about life became an irreplaceable part of their lives. Malik often helped Mrs. Emily with tasks she had once done alone in her solitude. They cooked together, cleaned, and sometimes even baked. In these moments, Mrs. Emily felt younger, as if she were reliving the beautiful days when Jonathan was still by her side. Malik also felt a sense of happiness, as if he had finally found the family he had always longed for. As the days passed, the bond between Mrs. Emily and Malik grew stronger, and they both knew that their fateful meeting that day had changed their lives forever. Mrs. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the uncanny resemblance between Malik and her lost son. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room, she decided to open up and share more details about her life with him. Her eyes reflected sadness as she recalled her past. She spoke of her childhood, the challenging yet happy years when she married her husband and gave birth to Jonathan. She spoke of Jonathan with all the love in her heart. He grew up in a loving family, always respectful and affectionate toward his mother. Jonathan was intelligent, dedicated to his studies, and always made her proud. Those years were the most beautiful of her life. But then, one day, Jonathan suddenly disappeared. Emily and her husband searched for him for years, trying everything to find clues, but every effort was in vain. The pain of losing their only son devastated them both. In the end, her husband couldn't bear the grief and passed away, leaving her alone with a void and an enduring sense of loss. Listening to Mrs. Emily's story, Malik felt his heart tighten. He could feel the depth of loss and sorrow she had endured. Malik knew he could never replace Jonathan, but he wanted to do everything he could to ease Mrs. Emily's loneliness. He gently held her hand and said softly, "Ma'am, I know no one can ever replace Jonathan, but I'm here for you. You're not alone." Mrs. Emily looked at Malik, tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were not tears of pain. They were of gratitude and comfort. As time passed, Mrs. Emily noticed more and more similarities between Malik and Jonathan. It wasn't just in their appearance, but also in their mannerisms, the small habits that reminded her of her son. A sudden thought arose in her mind. Could it be possible that Malik was somehow connected to Jonathan? Although she knew this might just be a hopeful fantasy, she couldn't stop thinking about it. One morning, Mrs. Emily hesitantly spoke to Malik. "Malik, I have a request. Would you listen and consider it?" Malik looked at her with a curious and concerned expression. Mrs. Emily continued, "I want you to take a DNA test. I know it sounds strange, but I can't help feeling that you might have a connection to my family." Malik was initially taken aback. He wasn't sure how to react. A DNA test was a serious matter and could reveal truths he had never imagined. But looking into Mrs. Emily's sincere and hopeful eyes, he felt he couldn't refuse. Finally, Malik nodded and agreed. "If this will give you some peace of mind, I'll do it." Mrs. Emily smiled, her eyes filled with hope. The next day, they went to the testing center together. Mrs. Emily was filled with nervous anticipation, while Malik felt a tension he had never experienced before. They sat waiting for the results in a state of mixed emotions, hope mingling with anxiety. Mrs. Emily kept glancing at Malik, wondering if what she felt was true, and if she might reclaim a piece of her painful past. On the day of the DNA test results, both Mrs. Emily and Malik were filled with nervous anticipation. Mrs. Emily had hardly slept the night before, her heart brimming with both anxiety and hope. Malik, too, couldn't hide his own nervousness, even though he was unsure of what the results might bring. When Mrs. Emily held the envelope containing the results, her hands trembled, and her heart pounded in her chest. She opened the envelope and read each line on the result sheet carefully. Her eyes widened, and her hands shook as she saw the positive result. Malik and Mrs. Emily truly had a blood relation. Malik was her biological grandson, the son of Jonathan, the son she had lost many years ago. Mrs. Emily couldn't believe her eyes. Tears streamed down her cheeks, tears of joy and deep emotion after years of separation. Malik was equally stunned. He never imagined he would actually be connected to Mrs. Emily. A whirlwind of emotions surged through him: surprise, happiness, and a touch of bewilderment. He embraced Mrs. Emily as she cried, feeling her tremble and realizing that from this moment on, he would no longer be alone. They held each other tightly, as if to make up for all the lost years. After discovering the truth about their blood relationship, Mrs. Emily decided to organize a small gathering to introduce Malik to her family members. Although she didn't have many relatives left, she knew this was a special occasion, and she wanted to share her joy with those she cherished. Malik agreed, though he felt a bit nervous about meeting new people. Mrs. Emily prepared for the gathering meticulously. She cooked traditional dishes that Jonathan used to love, flavors that carried the essence of family. Malik helped her with all the preparations, from decorating the house to setting up the dining table. He felt excited but also a bit anxious about facing Mrs. Emily's family. While he had accepted Mrs. Emily as his grandmother, he wasn't sure if the others would accept him. When Mrs. Emily's relatives arrived, they were all surprised and curious to hear Malik's story. Some were initially skeptical, but as they looked at the old photos and noticed the resemblance between Malik and Jonathan, they gradually accepted him. Malik tried his best to engage in conversation and get to know everyone, and his sincerity quickly won them over. The gathering unfolded in a warm and cheerful atmosphere. Mrs. Emily was overjoyed to see everyone gathered together, especially as she watched Malik blend into the family. She knew her life had changed forever. No longer filled with loneliness and sadness, she had Malik, the grandson she had never known, and she had found new hope in her life. Malik, too, felt that he was truly part of this family. He felt the love and warmth from everyone around him, something he had been missing throughout his childhood. He knew that from now on, his life would never be the same. He had a family, people who loved and cared for him, and that made him feel happier than ever. After the party, Malik began to deeply feel the change in his life. He had once lived alone, relying solely on himself. But now he had a real family. This realization made Malik feel as if a new chapter had opened in his life. He was no longer a homeless, rootless soul drifting through the world. He now had a place to return to, a family to love and protect. Malik often thought about his parents. He had never known who his biological parents were, only that he had been abandoned as a baby. He grew up in an orphanage, and his childhood memories mostly involved moving from one family to another, none of whom ever truly wanted to adopt him. Malik had always felt like a person without roots, belonging nowhere. But now, discovering his blood connection with Mrs. Emily made him feel as though he had finally found his lost roots. Mrs. Emily wasn't just a grandmother. She was someone who had given Malik a sense of heritage, a family he never knew existed. Mrs. Emily also noticed a change in Malik's demeanor. He became happier and more optimistic. Evenings spent together on the balcony, drinking tea and gazing at the stars, became precious moments for both of them. Malik shared stories of his time in the orphanage, the loneliness he faced, and his fears. Mrs. Emily listened, her eyes glistening with tears, realizing she hadn't only found a grandson, but also a piece of her past she thought was lost forever. Malik didn't just feel loved by Mrs. Emily. He felt it from the rest of the family as well. They treated him as a true member, making him feel respected and cherished. Malik started to make plans for the future, things he had never dared to consider before. He wanted to go back to school, find a better job, and build a stable life not only for himself but also to take care of Mrs. Emily and those he loved. Malik began to delve deeper into Mrs. Emily's past and what had driven her to uncover the truth about him. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, Mrs. Emily started sharing with Malik about the years she spent alone after losing Jonathan. It was a challenging time, but also a period in which she discovered inner strength. She spoke of sleepless nights, sitting by the window, gazing at the empty streets, and wondering if her son was still alive, if she would ever see him again. After Jonathan disappeared, Mrs. Emily endured a period of immense grief. At one point, she even lost her faith in life. But then she realized that if she gave up, everything would truly end. She decided to keep going, not just for herself but for Jonathan. She told herself that wherever her son was, she needed to live strongly, hoping that one day, they would reunite. When she met Malik, Mrs. Emily couldn't explain why she felt such a strong connection. Perhaps it was a mother's intuition, or maybe it was the love she had held on to all these years. Now finding a place to be shared, Malik listened, feeling the profound love and the pain that Mrs. Emily had carried. He knew he could never replace Jonathan, but he also understood that he could bring new joy and hope to her life. Mrs. Emily also emphasized that it was Malik's kindness that had driven her to seek the truth about him. She said, "You know, Malik, when you helped me that day, I saw a warmth in your eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. You restored my faith in people, in the power of love. And that's why I decided to pursue the truth to the very end." Malik was deeply moved by Mrs. Emily's words. He realized that his kindness and genuine care had brought them together. This made Malik even more determined to live a good life, not only to be Mrs. Emily's pride but also to help make up for the losses she had endured. Although Malik and Mrs. Emily's lives had changed for the better, things didn't always go smoothly. Malik faced many new challenges as he adapted to family life. There were times when he felt the pressure of integrating into a new family and of living up to Mrs. Emily's and everyone else's expectations. One of Malik's biggest challenges was finding a better job to support Mrs. Emily more fully. His factory job was stable, but the income wasn't enough for him to do more for his family. He started looking for new opportunities. But it was no easy task. Malik applied to various places, but his lack of experience and qualifications led to many rejections. Each rejection was disappointing, but he never gave up. He knew he had to keep trying, not just for himself but for Mrs. Emily. Additionally, Malik encountered skepticism from some people in society. As a black man becoming part of a white family, he wasn't always accepted by those around them. He faced whispers, judgmental looks, and even outright prejudice. Yet, he worked hard to stay calm and patient. Malik understood that the most important things were the love and support of Mrs. Emily and their family. This gave him the strength to keep going and to prove his worth. Mrs. Emily stood by Malik, encouraging and supporting him every step of the way. She understood that Malik was under a lot of pressure and always did her best to reassure him. She told him, "You don't need to try to be someone you're not. Just be yourself. And that's more than enough to make me proud." Her words became Malik's greatest source of motivation, helping him get through difficult times and never give up hope. Gradually, Malik and Mrs. Emily built a stable and happy life together. Malik eventually found a new job with a better income and more comfortable working conditions. He felt he was making progress, which boosted his confidence in caring for Mrs. Emily. The previous hardships had become valuable lessons, helping Malik grow stronger and more resilient. Mrs. Emily felt incredibly proud of Malik. She often reminded him that it didn't matter what job he held, as long as he gave his best. Malik felt incredibly fortunate to have her by his side. She was not only family but also a friend, always there to listen and share in his joys and sorrows. They spent more time together, each day becoming a beautiful memory. Together, they tended to their small garden, where the flowers Malik had planted were now in full bloom. Mrs. Emily and Malik often went for walks, visiting small cafes and enjoying the pastries they both loved. During these moments, Mrs. Emily felt younger, and Malik felt his life was filled with purpose. The love and family bond they shared went beyond daily care. It was about supporting each other through life's challenges. Malik knew that Mrs. Emily would always be there for him, and she knew that Malik would be by her side for the rest of her journey. They both understood that life could bring challenges and hardships, but with love and genuine care, they could overcome anything. The peaceful evenings together, baking sessions, and stargazing under the night sky, each of these moments became treasured memories, a testament to the family bond they had built. Mrs. Emily and Malik found not only comfort in each other but also the motivation to live better, to love, and to cherish every passing day. After all the turbulent days, Malik and Mrs. Emily decided to make plans for the future together. Malik wanted to continue his education to improve his career prospects, and Mrs. Emily fully supported his decision. One morning, as they sat sipping tea by their small garden, Mrs. Emily looked at Malik and asked, "Malik, have you ever thought about going back to school? I believe you could achieve wonderful things if given the opportunity." Malik thought for a moment, recalling his school years when he had to drop out early to earn a living. He had once dreamed of becoming an engineer, but life's hardships had forced him to abandon that dream. Now, with Mrs. Emily by his side, he felt a renewed motivation to pursue his unfinished dream. Malik decided to explore evening courses at a nearby community college. He knew balancing work and studies would be challenging, but he was ready to face it. Mrs. Emily was thrilled to see his determination. She even helped him gather study materials and assisted with his course registration. "I'll always be here to help you whenever you need," she said, her eyes filled with pride and hope. Malik felt his heart fill with resolve. He started relearning forgotten subjects, from math to physics. Every evening after work, he sat down at his study desk, supported and encouraged by Mrs. Emily. Malik's studies not only brought him closer to his dream of becoming an engineer but also deepened his bond with Mrs. Emily. She would often sit beside him, reading a book or knitting, occasionally smiling with encouragement as she watched him focus on his studies. However, Malik's academic journey was not always smooth. Balancing work and studies left him feeling exhausted and pressured at times. Some days, he worked late into the evening, and after coming home, he still had to sit down to study. The stress and fatigue sometimes made Malik feel discouraged. He began to wonder if he could really manage it, if studying would truly bring a positive change to his life. One evening, after a long day at work, Malik returned home with tired eyes and a heavy heart. He sat at his desk, staring at his books but unable to focus. Noticing the weariness on his face, Mrs. Emily approached him gently and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Malik, you don't need to push yourself too hard. Everything takes time and patience. You've done so well, and I'm always proud of you." Malik looked at Mrs. Emily, feeling her warmth and love. He knew he couldn't give up, not only because he was working toward his own future, but also because of the hopes and faith Mrs. Emily had placed in him. "I won't give up, Grandma. I'll do my best," he replied, giving her a tired yet determined smile. Mrs. Emily nodded, smiling back at Malik. She knew that no matter how challenging things got, he would persevere, because he had resilience and determination. She would always be there to support him, and she believed that with love and determination, they could overcome any obstacle together. During his studies, Malik began to realize the importance of connecting with the community. He joined school clubs where he could meet and befriend like-minded individuals. Although he was initially a bit shy, Malik gradually became more confident in interacting with others. He shared his story with them, telling them about Mrs. Emily and the challenges he had faced. Malik's new friends were deeply impressed by his story. They admired his determination and courage. Some even helped him with his studies, organizing study groups where they could exchange knowledge. Malik felt that he was no longer alone. He realized that beyond family, the community could also be a powerful source of support, helping him rise in life. Mrs. Emily was thrilled to see Malik expanding his social circle. She encouraged him to participate in community volunteer activities, and Malik eagerly accepted. He joined programs to help the homeless and attended fundraisers for underprivileged children. Malik felt great happiness in helping others, just as he had helped Mrs. Emily on that fateful day. One afternoon, after finishing a volunteer event, Malik returned home with a radiant smile. He told Mrs. Emily about the children he met and the touching stories he had heard. Mrs. Emily listened attentively, feeling the joy in Malik's voice. She knew he was truly growing, not only in knowledge but also in character. As time passed, the bond between Malik and Mrs. Emily grew stronger. They were not only grandmother and grandson but also friends and companions in life. The challenges and hardships they had faced brought them closer, helping them understand and appreciate each other more deeply. Malik felt that his life had completely changed since he met Mrs. Emily, and Mrs. Emily felt equally fortunate to have Malik by her side. One evening, as they sat on the balcony, gazing at the starry sky, Mrs. Emily looked at Malik and said, "Malik, you know, our meeting wasn't just a coincidence. I believe destiny brought you to me so that we could help heal each other's losses." Malik looked back at her, warmth and gratitude filling his heart. "I feel the same way, Grandma. Without you, I don't know where my life would have gone. You've given me a family, a place to belong." Mrs. Emily smiled, taking Malik's hand. "We've found each other, and that's what matters most. I believe you'll go far, and I'll always be here to support you." Malik felt the boundless love from her, and he knew he was no longer alone. He had a family, a place to belong, and he was determined to do everything he could to protect and cherish it. They sat there, under the starlit sky, hand in hand, feeling the peace and happiness they had found after so many difficult years. For Malik and Mrs. Emily, their fateful meeting had brought them more than just a grandmother-grandson relationship. It had restored their faith, hope, and love, things they had once thought lost forever. Malik and Mrs. Emily had truly become a family, but that didn't mean they stopped opening their hearts to the love and friendship of others. Once Malik found stability in his studies and work, he began thinking about building a network of close friends and supportive connections in his life. Malik decided to host a small gathering at home, inviting his classmates and neighbors whom he and Mrs. Emily had gotten to know over time. The gathering took place on a warm Sunday afternoon, with traditional dishes Mrs. Emily had prepared early in the morning. The house was filled with warmth and joy as everyone laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed each other's company. The neighbors brought small gifts to show their appreciation for the wonderful gathering. Laughter rang out, kind words were exchanged, and Malik felt the love and connection between people more strongly than ever. He realized that family is not only those connected by blood, but also those who are willing to stand by you and support each other through life's challenges. Mrs. Emily saw the happiness in Malik's eyes, and her heart was filled with joy as well. She knew that her remaining years would no longer be lonely, for she had found a remarkable grandson. Through his determination and kindness, Malik had brought back beautiful days she once thought were lost forever. One day, as Malik and Mrs. Emily sat together, she suddenly remembered an old box of Jonathan's belongings, her son who had gone missing. Mrs. Emily smiled at Malik and said, "Malik, I want to show you something very special." She stood up, opened the cabinet, and took out a small wooden box, worn with age. Inside were mementos of Jonathan, letters, photos, and even some old toys he used to love. Malik picked up the photos, looking at Jonathan's face. There was a strange resemblance between Jonathan and himself. He felt a strong connection to someone he had never met. Malik also found letters Jonathan had written to Mrs. Emily, each line expressing boundless love for his mother. His eyes welled up as he felt the depth of family love and understood that he had become an irreplaceable part of Mrs. Emily's life. Mrs. Emily shared stories about Jonathan, happy and sad memories, moments she had cherished with him. Malik listened intently, feeling as if he was living within those memories, as if he had always been part of the family. Mrs. Emily's stories weren't just her own memories. They were her way of sharing a piece of her past, helping Malik understand and appreciate the love they now shared even more deeply. With everything he had been through, Malik increasingly understood the true meaning of being part of a family. He was no longer a lonely young man facing life's challenges on his own. Now, he had Mrs. Emily, friends, and a community that loved and supported him. This gave Malik the strength and confidence to face whatever challenges life might bring. Malik began to think about bringing Mrs. Emily to live with him once he was financially secure. He wanted to take care of her better and ensure she wouldn't have to worry about anything. One afternoon, as they sipped tea together, Malik shared his plan with her. She listened, her eyes filling with emotion. She knew Malik's love for her was genuine, and she felt profoundly grateful to have found such a wonderful grandson. Mrs. Emily smiled and said, "Malik, you have given me more than I could have ever hoped for. You are the greatest joy of my life. If that's what you want, I will be by your side, and together we will live happily." Malik embraced her, feeling the warmth and love they shared. He knew that no matter what challenges life might bring, he and Mrs. Emily would face them together. Malik and Mrs. Emily's lives extended beyond building a happy family. They spread their love and compassion to the community around them. Malik continued participating in volunteer activities, and this time, he brought Mrs. Emily along. Together, they visited the elderly living alone, helped families in difficult situations, and shared the love they had found in each other. Malik realized that love and kindness weren't just for family. They were meant to be shared with everyone. He and Mrs. Emily became role models in the community, and their story spread, inspiring many others. People spoke of Malik and Mrs. Emily as a testament to love without boundaries. A black man and a white elderly woman who found each other and built a family full of love. One morning, while Malik and Mrs. Emily were strolling in the park, a woman approached them. She smiled and said, "I've heard your story, and I truly feel inspired. Thank you both for restoring my faith in love and kindness." Malik and Mrs. Emily looked at each other, smiling happily. They knew that their actions brought joy not only to themselves but also to those around them. Malik and Mrs. Emily had found each other, and together they had overcome countless hardships, building a new life full of love and hope. Their fateful meeting changed not only their lives but also served as proof of the power of love, compassion, and faith in goodness. For Malik and Mrs. Emily, finding each other was the most important thing. From that day forward, their lives would be filled with joy, happiness, and an unbreakable bond.